Cheryl?
Yes, it looks perfect. Thank you.
Okay,
Oh, and it looks like Jim is rejoining us.
great.
Welcome, Jim.
Hello, everyone. Just a very quick check-in. Could I get somebody to let me know where we are?
We are just about to start. Are you able to share your slides and facilitate this evening?
I believe that I am. That was one of these.
Amanda,
Want me to stop sharing then, Jim?
sharing. Yeah. And thanks everybody for your patience. It looks like our facilitator is back and joining us again.
So happy to be there. That was one of those cartoon moments where I was just about to say hello and welcome, and my internet disappeared. I'm really happy to be here with you all today. So thank you. I'm sorry, have we gone through the housekeeping things? Yep, no, okay, housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded today. So if we could please all mute our microphones, that would be great. There will be opportunity to unmute your microphone if you have questions. I'd like to propose that if you have questions during the talk, that you write them into the chat, and we can collect those questions and then put those to the speaker at the end of their talk. So please do feel free to send those questions in as quickly and as much as you want. And then at the end of those talk, again, if there's something that you prefer to speak to the presenter about, to ask them yourself, you can unmute yourself and do that. All right. Want to mention just very quickly today that everything that's being done here today is voluntary. So there's a very impressive group of people that are working to bring this to you here today. But even with these volunteer efforts, there are still costs associated with this, and there's a lot of great ideas towards the educational portion that we're trying to bring this to everyone. And so there is an opportunity to try to help, for asking for help to try to bring these events to everyone and put them online, keep them online, and make them available for people to see. So if you have an opportunity, if you're interested to take a look at this page on the Patron City website, there is an opportunity to put in a donation if you'd like. This compost program is being brought to you by a host of different people, currently called the Connecticut Compost Alliance. And it's just a large group of people interested in the aerobic composting process. It is a very diverse group of people working together to coordinate different opportunities, focusing on supporting and educating current and future composters, allowing to learn, network, and engage for the improvement of compost as well as our soils. We do have one more event coming up online. For the online portion, there's some more in-person events coming up here, but April 6th, if you haven't registered for that already, please feel free to take a look at that schedule and get yourself registered for that. Looking forward to it. Large municipal commercial scale composting should be really good. Then the in-person event, the items that are coming up, there's been some effort to pull together locations where people can go and talk and see and feel the composting process. One note that the first one is scheduled for April 2nd is going to have to be rescheduled. So there are a couple of people that have signed up, but there's an effort right now going to change that April 2nd date, and that will get sorted out here very quickly and then reposted up to the Compost website where you can register for that large municipal scale composting. They do have a great program for that. Would definitely encourage you to check it out. And while you're looking at the information, you can sign up for any of those other dates as well. So for today, we're going through our welcoming process. We've got some fantastic speakers for you today, but we're going to have two different sessions. The first session is going to be talking about on-farm composting, some of the observations and real-life experiences of trying to do the on-farm composting. After that is done, we'll take a short break, and then we'll return. And we've got a second session talking about biochar, some of the production, as well as some of the effects. What happens when you add biochar to soil, looking at ag soils. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started with that first session right now. So we're going to, the session is going to be talking about on-farm composting. We've got Andrew Carpenter from Northern Tilth. We'll be talking about observations and recommendations of on-farm composting. In addition, we're also very lucky to have Jess Stone with us from Cold Spring Farm here in Connecticut. And she's going to be talking about the real world challenges and the realities of trying to do on-farm composting and share some of her insight with that. So if you will excuse me for just a minute, I need to switch my files here so I can do a proper introduction. I'm going to introduce Andrew Carpenter, and then immediately following, I will also introduce Jess Stone. Andrew Carpenter from Northern Tilth is a certified soil scientist, certified crop advisor, and certified nutrient management planning specialist. He's been in the recycling, recycling organic residuals and developing recycling programs for materials that have not historically been reused since 1992. He has extensive experience in research, planning, and handling technical issues related to the reuse of organic materials. Andrew received his MS in plant, soil, and environmental science at the University of Maine. He then founded Northern Tilth LLC, which is an environmental consulting firm focusing on organic waste management and building soil health in 2003. Andrew is currently a board member of the Compost Research and Education Foundation, or CREF. And with Andrew presenting also today is Jess Stone. Jess Stone has been farming for at least 25 years, she says, and can be found in central Connecticut at Cold Spring Farm, where food and nature grow together. The farm grows and harvests new life for family, friends, and neighbors who have a passion for healthy food. Cold Spring Farm has an active farm stand, a community-supported agriculture, or CSA, with shareholders, and can also be found at local farmers markets. As part of the vegetable production on the farm, they actively work to reduce waste and return as much as they can to the soils as compost for healthy soils and healthy plants. So with that, Andrew, I will hand it over to you.
All right. Okay, what do you see?
We've got presentation mode, big excavator, and compost.
You're in presentation mode. That's what you see.
I see
You don't
your
see notes
presentation.
or anything.
No notes, just presentation.
That's perfect. That's actually what I was shooting for.
Fantastic.
Yeah, our company does a lot of nutrient management planning with farms all over New England, and we work with some of the biggest farms in New England and also some very, very small farms. In that process, we work a lot with farms that have on composting, that are composting on the farm. And we do see a lot of problems associated, a lot of frustration that farms have with it, and sometimes maybe a lack of technical guidance. So we're going to talk about some of the observations we've had that we've seen on farms, and also we're going to end up talking about a grant, a Conservation Innovation Grant that we got from the NRCS in Connecticut to work specifically with 6 farms that have on-farm composting operations, to see if essentially observations, recommendations, and some changes in practice can help make the process a little bit more successful for the farm. So in this presentation, I'm actually going to go over some basics of composting. I'm going to focus on how those relate to on-farm composting, and in that I'm distinguishing it between larger commercial scale composting, municipal composting, and looking really more at the types of things that we see in on-farm composting operations. So some of this stuff may be a little bit of review, but I think it's all important in terms of what we end up seeing on farms and how some of those composting operations can be optimized. And I'll tell you that in presentations, the question and answer portion is always my favorite. So I do encourage people to either write in the chat box or have questions at the end. I'm very interested in engaging on those. So one of the big things is sometimes we have a sense that all composting operations are sort of headed towards the same goal. And they're really not, especially when you talk about on-farm composting operations. They're really different from commercial operations. There's some of them that operate like commercial operations, but most of them, as opposed to trying to create a really high value, say, bagged product, a lot of them are just looking more at material management, but they run the gamut from really just trying to well, I'll go to the next slide. In some cases, it's composting is done to help manage a wet material, a wet manure. In some cases, and we actually see this quite a bit, manure itself is great for applying to soil without it being composted in certain situations, and a lot of bulk agriculture or large scale agriculture. But we often see farms that have material that simply can't get through a manure spreader well. We see this especially on beef operations where there's a lot of waste hay in the compost itself, and it doesn't lend itself to spreading well through a traditional box spreader. And so in some cases, a lot of cases, we work with farms that are simply trying to break down the straw or hay that's in the manure in order to make it spread a little better. A huge number of our bigger farms the only reason they're composting on farm is to manage their mortalities or compost their mortalities. On some of the smaller and vegetable operations we work with, they're doing it in order to meet pathogen reduction requirements so that they can use it in vegetables or for food production without having the waiting periods that might otherwise be required if it's not being composted. And another thing we see is on farms that have use a lot of bedding or have a lot of carbonaceous material in their manure, if they were to apply that prior to composting, instead of adding nitrogen to the soil, they would actually be immobilizing nitrogen in soil and making less plant available nitrogen than they would otherwise have. So it's a really wide range. And then you do have the operations that are looking to make a high quality material and actually have an additional source of revenue, a revenue stream for the farm. So the economic models vary greatly. In some cases, and this is happening more and more, we have people that are interested in the tip fees, farms that are interested in the tip fees that might come along with food waste that's now being diverted from landfills. That sort of the other extreme of that is people that are actually buying in materials to make a really nice finished compost that will have really high-end sale value. So they're making their money on the sales end as opposed to the tip fee. And a lot of them are simply a hybrid of the two. And some of them, again, are just really for materials management on the farm. This is where I think this might be a little bit of a repeat of some of the things you said, because Jim said you did have a really extensive webinar on composting basics, but this really, all of this goes back to the biology of composting itself. When you're trying to optimize your process, you always have to go back to the biology. So for those microbes to do that work of converting that fresh organic matter, oxidizing that organic matter and converting it to mature compost, they have a few basic requirements. They need a certain amount of oxygen, they need water, they need a good mix of the two, not too much of one, not too much of the other. And the food itself is the organic, they're oxidizing those organic carbon bonds in fresh organic matter. So they actually need an organic matter that is available to the microbes themselves. It should be, you know, if you're way outside of a good pH range, if you're far away from a neutral pH, like too acidic or too alkaline, then you have the potential to essentially slow down the microbial process. Same with temperature. And again, the volatile solids, when I talk about volatile solids, I'm talking about organic matter that itself, the organic carbon that's in there. So in all the activity, the microbial activity is happening in just this sort of interface between it's kind of like watery films on the outside of the organic matter, mixed with some of the air that's in there. The optimum moisture content during the composting process to drive the microbes to do this efficiently is around 50 to 60% moisture, so 40 to 50% solids content, about 5 to 10% oxygen. If you have too little, the microbes, the process essentially goes anaerobic. It's no longer an aerobic process. It becomes very inefficient at that point. It's good to have a mix of particle size. Bulk density is really important. This is one of the biggest constraints that we see on a lot of farms. On paper, an ideal bulk density of your blend at the start of the composting process is around 1,000 pounds per cubic yard. So to put that into perspective, soil itself is typically around 2,400 pounds per cubic yard. Dry sawdust is maybe 350 to 450 pounds per cubic yard. And wet manure or bedded manure that's not a liquid manure, but you know, somewhat bedded manure is typically around 1,450 pounds per cubic yard. So on its own, that's a little too dense. And when you have the high bulk density, essentially you have a hard time with the air going through the piles and providing enough air to drive this aerobic process. There's a carbon to nitrogen ratio that is ideal, although this again is sort of more of book value than anything else, and I'll tell you why. There's some caveats to that. But one way to think of it is microbes have in the body of the microbes, their carbon to nitrogen ratio is about 8 to 1. And when they oxidize organic carbon, about 1/3 of that carbon ends up getting incorporated into the microbial biomass, and about 2/3 of it goes off into the atmosphere. So for them to have just the right amount for their own habitat, for them to have just the right amount for their metabolism would be, if this makes sense based on what I just said, it's around 24 to 1. This is not always the case. There's the big caveats in that, but if you want to have kind of a nice balance, that's kind of a target to shoot for, somewhere around 25 to 1 C/N ratio. So manure, typically on its own, an unbedded manure, will have a C/N ratio somewhere around 8 to 1. Trying to think of some other, leaves, sawdust, those are easily over 100 to 1. So getting the right blend is really important so that you do get that carbon to nitrogen ratio into the range where you'll have the maximum microbial activity. Again, as I mentioned, pH does make a difference. You can certainly compost outside of like a good range, sort of between 6 and 8 on a pH scale, but you can definitely compost outside of that range, but that it's within that range where you're going to get the maximum efficiency of the microbes. The heat in a compost pile is generated by the microbes themselves. During this oxidation process, they're generating excess heat. So the heat is an indication, a partial indication of the amount of microbial activity that's occurring within the pile. When you start the process, you're in a temperature range called the mesophilic range, and there are certain bacteria and microbes that are more efficient then, and then you get into the thermophilic range up over 45 degrees C, where things start to go quite quickly and a little bit more intensively. And then over time, there's not as much energy. You've sort of decomposed a lot of that organic carbon or oxidized it, and the temperature drops again. Oops, need to go back up. Volatile solids, again, here I'm talking about organic matter, and that's, it's important, even the type of organic matter or organic carbon that's in there is important. So you might have a perfect C/N ratio, but the carbon itself that's in there might be unavailable to the microbes for one reason or another. One example of that is peat from a peat bog. That carbon is very mature already, not that accessible to the microbes. It doesn't provide as much energy or food. Or say biochar itself, where the carbon that's in that material has been carbonized or transformed to a graphite-like form. It's not really available to the microbes, so it doesn't count as your carbon in your carbon to nitrogen ratio, if that makes sense. One of the things I often talk to farms about is why they are composting. Because in a lot of cases with manure, directly applying that manure might be, you might get a little better bang for your buck in terms of the nutrient value of it. So the nitrogen that's in manure, in our own poop, and a lot of, in food waste and a lot of organic waste, consists of a lot of organic nitrogen in the form of proteins, and that actually isn't available to plants. That material, that form of nitrogen has to be mineralized to an inorganic form, either nitrate or ammonium, before it can be taken up by plants. And in manure, especially if it's got a low C/N ratio, it doesn't have a lot of bedding. Those rates of mineralization from the organic nitrogen form, again, typically proteins, to the inorganic forms, is a relatively rapid process that provides a lot of plant available nitrogen. When you compost the material, so here are just some some comparisons of how much in the first year of the organic nitrogen that are in these different manures will mineralize and become plant available. To compost it, you've made that, sort of transformed that nitrogen already to more stable forms while you're doing the composting process. And so your nitrogen availability can actually go down substantially from what it would have been had you applied that manure directly. Now, that's not to say applying manure is always the best thing. Like I said, there are a lot of reasons that people do compost, but it is one thing to consider when you're deciding on a farm if you want to compost the manure or not. This is just sort of a little further example of that. Plant available nitrogen from chicken manure, say, which I know there's a lot of in Connecticut. We work with a lot of farms that use it. On a per wet ton basis would be about 21 pounds of plant available nitrogen. If you took that same chicken manure and composted it, you'd go for the amount of plant available nitrogen in there might be decreased by almost 5 times. And at the same time, the phosphorus that's in there probably won't change much. It's conserved in the process and doesn't transform that much. So it changes your nitrogen to phosphorus ratio in terms of plant availability goes down a bit. So just one of the things that I always like to talk about is this process of transforming organic matter to more essentially stable, fresh organic matter to stable organic matter. So when you add fresh organic matter to soil or a compost pile, but the same thing happens. It happens a little bit more slowly in soil than in the compost pile. But essentially, microbes see that material. They get very excited because they know there's oxygen. They know that there's energy in the organic compost, organic carbon bonds, and they start oxidizing it. In that process, about, like I said, 2/3 of that carbon goes off into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, and another third is assimilated in the microbial biomass and also the more mature organic matter. And nitrogen then gets mineralized, some to plant available forms, some gets assimilated by the microbes, and if you have too much of it, some may leach out of the atmosphere or leach out of the soil. But all of this, whether you're doing it in, if you're directly applying material to the soil in the form of manure or composting at first, the process is generally the same, but it occurs much quicker in a compost pile because you're kind of engineered to do that, whereas in the soil, this will happen a little bit more slowly over time. Both of them will probably add about the same amount of organic matter per unit manure to the soil in the long run. In terms of composting technologies, this varies so much on farms, but I just want to talk about a few. And again, I know you've been through this in the basics class, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. Windrow composting is sort of like what you think of archetypal compost pile, where the material's mixed up, set out into windrows that are designed really to maximize the exchange of air with the atmosphere, to give those microbes what they need to drive that oxidation process. And then they're turned occasionally in order to, as the windrows become devoid of oxygen because the microbes are using up the oxygen in the piles, you turn the windrows to incorporate more oxygen and then speed up again the process. And you do that until essentially you've exhausted a lot of the energy that's in there and the piles won't heat up anymore, at which point you're going to have a mature compost. There are also static piles, and this is something we see on farms a lot, and it's essentially a heap. They're called static because they're not moved, they're not turned like a windrow, and you're basically counting on getting as much air in there as you can just based on the shape, but over time, that process is going to slow down. So typically this is a slow process. If you have enough room, we see great compost coming out of heaps that people have piled up that happen to have a good mix of feedstock, but it's not a time efficient way to go. And you can get, big, massive anaerobic pockets within those static piles. And then there's aerated static piles, in which case you're putting them in a pile, you're not turning them, but you're forcing air through them, typically from underneath. And you can either be pushing air through the piles or actually pulling them from the top of the piles and then out back. So typically you'll have a bay like this and some pipes on the floor, which could actually be embedded in the concrete or on top of the surface of the concrete, and blowers, which you wouldn't be able to see here, that would be in the back, that can either push air through the piles or draw air through the piles and bring it back. So this is the picture of an aerated static pile with positive aeration, where what you can't see down here is tubes that are pushing air through this pile. So in this case, the aerated static piles can be great if you're willing to put in the time to actually build them and make sure they're running properly and make really good mixes, because if your mixes are off for the aerated static piles, it's going to be harder to get the pile to cook. Windrows can be a little bit more forgiving in that way. Another element of aerated static piles that are nice is they take up a lot less space per unit area that you're composting, because you don't have to have the big space around them in order to move equipment. And you can typically make them a little bit higher and still get good, efficient air movement through them. As I say, they have advantages and disadvantages, both of them. Windrow composting takes up a much bigger footprint. You can sometimes cut down your footprint by 4 to 5 times if you switch from a windrow operation to a aerated static pile operation. So this is the farm that we work with in Massachusetts, where we did just that. They had very successful composting operation, made great compost this way. It took them a long time, but it also was a little bit of a resource concern. It took up a lot of area, and they're doing the same amount of composting in about 1/5 of the area that they were before, after switching to aerated static pile. But like I say, windrow composting can be very forgiving. The mix is not quite as critical, and over time you can turn something that at first might seem like it's going to be hard to compost into a nice finished compost. I'm just looking at my time to make sure I'm going to have enough. Feedstock considerations are really important for all the reasons I mentioned before. So simply because you have bedded manure doesn't mean you have the right feedstock to make a good compost. Oftentimes, and that's a lot of the issue on the farms that we work with. They're trying to work with materials that they already have on farm, not necessarily buying materials in. And in that case, you can't always find on that one farm the ideal mix to get your carbon to nitrogen ratio correct, as well as porosity and bulk density, and especially moisture content. So for us, we often will make a simple spreadsheet that probably a lot of you have worked with in the past, something like this, to use the characteristics of your feedstock to make a blend ahead of time that will have the sort of the characteristics that you're looking for in the final blend, or at least get as close as possible to you can to those ideal conditions. I won't go too much into this equipment. Is sort of more relevant probably to larger scale operations. Most of the farms that we're working with have turned windrows or static piles, and in some cases aerated static piles, but they're turning the piles typically with skid steer or a bucket loader, building the piles that way as well. There are a few that we work with that have windrow turners. Cost a little more, but it can be great for time saving if you have a big enough operation. And then again, there are some that actually have aerated static pile operations. So here's again another look at a aerated static pile system with the blowers behind the bays that are blowing air in, and in some cases pulling air out. Some of these can be made to be reversing, so they can push air out for a while and then pull it in. But it's all, the aerated static piles is all about providing just the right amount of oxygen to a mix that's already got kind of the ideal conditions in terms of bulk density, moisture, and carbon to nitrogen ratio. I'm going to skip right past that one. So in terms of the grant we have, we work as a company, we do a lot of work through for farms, but through the NRCS. And in that case, when we do what are called nutrient management plans or comprehensive nutrient management plans, essentially what we're doing is trying to find areas where we know that the NRCS could help a farm out in one way or the other. The NRCS's funding for farm projects is typically based on addressing resource concerns. And so typically that's going to be erosion, which is how the NRCS first came into place after the Dust Bowl. But more recently, a lot of keeping nutrients from manure out of water bodies or oversaturating areas on the farm with nutrients that might come from manure. So when we're looking, and I'll get into this when I discuss the grant, but essentially when we're doing work for farms sort of on behalf of their relationship with the NRCS, we're looking to both improve their operations, in this case, the on-farm composting operations, but also finding potential resource concerns related to those composting operations to see how the NRCS might be able to improve the operation, both to protect water quality and soil quality, but also make their operation a little bit more efficient. So we do, we see a lot of on-farm composting operations that are simply a farm trying to manage material without maybe having the money or foresight to protect resources around that composting operation. So we see runoff, we see surface water runoff that can cause erosion. We see nutrient-rich water and manure going off of those compost pads. So we're always trying to find ways that we can both, again, protect resources on the farms while improving their composting operations. So in some ways that means providing an impermeable surface to compost on, so you're not eroding the soil and mucking it up, but also allowing all the surface water to be run off to one location where it can then go through what's called a vegetative treatment area in order to treat that water. And in some cases, it means covering the operation. So this, if I go back here, this was actually done. This sort of transformation here for this one farm was done with the money from an EQIP grant through the NRCS to cover their operation. This is just a conceptual look at sort of an ideal composting setup for a farm. It's very unlikely. Most farms that we work with don't have anything like this, and even after working with the NRCS, it's unlikely to have all of these things where you have a place, a good access road to come into, a paved area in which to collect the feedstocks, and make your initial mixes, do the composting, have storage there, ultimately have the water running in this direction so that sediment gets caught, and then having either a holding pond or some kind of vegetative treatment area to protect the runoff, to make sure the runoff doesn't get into adjacent wetlands or streams. But this is sort of what we're trying to work towards with a lot of farms. One of the things too that is really important to consider for on-farm composting is that the theory of composting will only get you so far. Like I say, there are a lot of caveats to all of the elements that I talk about that you're trying to optimize in order to get the bugs to do the work of composting of fresh organic matter efficiently. But the theory and getting into the right pocket, those ideal ranges, will only get you so far. It's a biological process. It's mysterious, sort of magical. And I am always encouraging people, if they're having a problem, to simply tweak things, tweak their recipe, tweak their turning schedules, anything to see what might help, because sometimes on what should work on paper simply doesn't. So I'm going to get to the, because I think I'm running a little long on the basics. So I'm going to start to get to, I'm going to get to the grant itself. So as I mentioned, we work with, we do a lot of work throughout New England with farms, mostly with livestock operations, but more and more with vegetable operations as well. And a lot of that ultimately ends up tangentially involving on-farm composting, because it's one of the areas of manure management or on-farm resource management that has also the potential to cause resource concerns. So that's sort of where we come in. We also, we do work with municipality and commercial composters as well, and providing technical services. But for farms, it's our entryway to the on-farm composting operation is usually through this larger effort of making sure we're minimizing resource concerns on farms. So, and Jeff will talk about this a bit. We do find a large share of on-farm composting operations that are there because the farms need to manage material, but ultimately are not having a lot of luck with making the composting operation work the way they would like it to work. And so because of that, the composting portion of the farming operation is often an afterthought, and sometimes it's frustrating enough that it ultimately gets abandoned. So the goal with the Conservation Innovation Grant that we got through the Connecticut RCS is to determine if relatively simple technical services combined with practices that we know the NRCS can provide farms can improve composting on New England farms. And what the NRCS and through these Conservation Innovation Grants is typically interested in is finding, essentially developing practice, what they call practices that they can fund in the future. So in our case, we are trying to determine if we can develop what we're calling right now a compost optimization practice that would allow NRCS to fund technical service providers to work with farms to optimize their on-farm composting operations. So in this case, we have 6 farms that we're working with in Connecticut. On purpose, we tried to find a really wide array of on-farm composting operations. So from those that are really minimally managed to those that are highly managed long-term projects that in some cases have become a business on their own for the farm. So briefly, we just started this process. Essentially this last late fall, we met with the farms, went over their composting operation, took samples of both the compost that they're making and the feedstocks that they're putting into their compost blends. Also looked for potential resource concerns on the farm that we knew that NRCS might be able to help with. And now we're developing plans for them to tweak their operations to try and improve. And then we're going to be monitoring those with the farms. Once they put in place those recommendations, we're going to be monitoring it and see how it does help the process, hopefully significantly. So this first one is a mid-sized dairy, and their reason for composting is solely to handle mortality. So the older cows, adult cows that die on the farm. It's sometimes can be tough to manage, especially when the farm gets bigger. You get a lot of animals that are dying each year, just naturally. And composting does seem to be the most environmentally friendly process for managing the mortalities. So in this case, it's sort of in the back 40 on this farm. It's something that they do, but they don't put a huge amount of time into. In this case, this one actually looks a lot better than a lot of the farms that we work with. So they do a good job of covering the mortalities. They actually have a relatively good mix. So the piles get relatively hot. You can see here, maybe up at around 110. It was a little cold out, but they get relatively good temperatures there. But it is, again, sort of an afterthought, and this is a static pile. It's not something they're actively turning. So in this case, what we're likely going to be recommending is ultimately for them to have a pad on which they're composting. There is some runoff that occurs here. You can see some of the dead trees in the background. So that the water could be directed either to a vegetative treatment area or the facility itself could be covered. And also more frequent turning of the pile, because what we've noticed was these the oldest areas here are 2 years old, and they could be composting this much more in a much more time efficient process, which would mean the area, it wouldn't take up quite as much area on the farm. And then a possible change in feedstocks too. So the second one is a horse farm that has a state-of-the-art facility. It's an aerated static pile facility that was built in part with money from the NRCS. And by anyone's sort of estimation, this would be a great thing to have. But interestingly, this farm has had a lot of trouble making a nice finished compost, even with what is a really good on-farm composting operation, sort of state-of-the-art. It seems, so this is the finished compost here, and it seems in this case, it will probably be a relatively easy fix. Essentially their feedstock is too dry, and because it's covered, I mean, for most farms in New England, especially farms that are composting manure, covering the operation is great because we typically get a little bit more rainfall than we want, and the piles get saturated fairly quickly. In this case, they're starting with a really dry horse bedding and some additional sawdust. And the piles dry out very quickly once they start to heat, and they're almost impossible to re-wet at that point. So it's a good, there's nothing wrong with this setup. It's a great setup. It's just, in this case, seems to be a feedstock issue that we think can be resolved. And one of the things that's interesting in this process is we think that there might be a relatively easy solution of this farm trading some of their feedstock with another farm that has feedstock that's a little too wet and a little higher in nitrogen. And both of them would benefit from it without, I don't think, a lot of cost in terms of transport. This is a new bedded pack for a beef operation that has an adjacent waste storage area, which is meant for composting. So they essentially have 3 bays down here. Really great, again, state-of-the-art facility, great for the animal health, really easy to clean. The thing that we found is, and we see this on actually a lot of farms, is areas where, or farms where bins have been built for static pile composting, but have no aeration. And so in a way, you're really, by doing this, slowing down the composting process quite a bit. Even if this were, you'd be better off in terms of air circulation through these piles to not have to not have a bin set up, but just simply have piles that have a little space between them. Because this is gonna, the amount of air, sort of the pathways for air getting into the pile are really minimized by having 3 sides around it. So there's the option of, you can retrofit something like this with an aeration system. It's a little bit, there's an expense to that, and then it will probably require a little bit more work for the farm in terms of getting this recipe right. This one would be a little dense for that. Alternatively, it could, one of the things we're looking at here is essentially having this act as individual piles that would go sequentially. They'd get turned from this pile would be, or essentially be accumulated, then it'd be turned here, and you get some aeration in this process, then turned into this one. So you'd sequentially go down this way. It would also require a little bit more room outside for curing the end pile, which that wouldn't be completely composted at the end of that process. This is an operation that is a piggery in Connecticut. It's also an operation because they've been a piggery for such a long time. They're in the food waste collection business, and they're starting to collect more food waste. So they've had, they've been composting on site for a long time, and essentially they have static piles, and they're fairly large. And it's a great operation that they also allow the pigs to feed on some of the food waste that's left in the composting, but they're also getting, they're directly getting food waste as well. And the finished compost is really nice. They have a fairly good market for it. It gets a lot of soil mixed in with it, so that final compost is almost more like a topsoil than a compost itself, but it's a very rich topsoil. So that in itself is a material that's pretty easily marketed. But they want to expand. This takes a long time to get from start to finished compost. So they're at the same time they're looking at possibly getting bedded pack facilities, and this is something that the NRCS may fund for them, is bedded pack facility, and then having an active composting pile. So you're going directly from the bedded packs onto a bigger pad, and ultimately then onto a curing pad. But this is something we see a lot, is when the composting is done not on a pad, there is a lot of soil that gets incorporated into the compost itself unintentionally. And then this farm is actually one that has a completely separate composting business. It's very, it's established. They make a great product. There's not too much that they would probably be able to learn from us. We're learning a lot from them in going through this process, but they are, and they have two types of composting. Their biggest operation is simply big windrows that are turned periodically with a loader and then screened. They have a great market for the material. Some of it they sell in bulk and some of it they sell bagged. And then they also have a separate aerated static pile system. And part of the draw in putting this in is they have a heat recovery system. So some of the heat that's being generated during the composting in this aerated static pile goes through a heat exchanger and heats water for their milk parlor. So they're saving money that way. And I think they may use heat for one other thing. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, they've got two different systems. Both of them, from our perspective, are working great. We do think that the windrow system could be made a little bit more efficient in terms of timing, and part of that would be improving the pre-mixing before going into the piles and having a more prescribed turning schedule based on temperature monitoring in the piles. But as you can see, it's a really wide array of composting operations that we're working with in this grant, which we really like. And we know, again, everyone sort of has different goals. So, and then the last is actually Jess's farm, and I'll have her talk about that. They also have two sort of different piles. One of their sort of biggest composting operation over here with the manure, and then a leaf and yard waste composting windrow in another location there. But I'll let Jess talk about that.
Hi there, Jess Stone, Cold Spring Farm, and I think I can be heard. I see that my mute is off, so that's good. So part of my background is in sustainable agriculture and natural resource management and some other fun things. I mention that because I've had the educational background to work with the soils on the farm and to see from the book standpoint, from the impractical all the way to realistic over many, many years of high school and ag and education in college, and then actually doing the farming after working on other farms for years. And so I've been doing the farming for a long time in different capacities, but for myself for a good amount of time. So starting out really small and doing more of the homestead and the small farming, like growing into that type of work where I actually earn a living doing it. And as a result, I've grown the farm over all those years. And with some help, we produce quite a lot of food. So vegetables, herbs, flowers, and fruits. But we also raise cows, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens, turkeys, ducks, geese, peacocks, we have dogs, cats, and kids. So with all of those animals and plants on the farm with several acres that we grow on in the fields, and then also high tunnels and an off-site greenhouse that we grow year round. We are working with about 350 acres in total, including some forest land and areas for hay fields. And we have a couple of concrete pads, but the real reality is that we didn't buy a clean slate. We bought an old dairy farm that went through so many years of ownership as a dairy farm, and then us being the second owners in all of those hundreds of years. There were long periods of renters, including 2 other dairy farms. So not only did we buy the farm and its old buildings, but we also bought all of the past benefits and errors of managing land. And so we're fortunate to be one of the highest points in the county for Middlesex County. But the upside is that we get some wind, and the downside is that we get some wind. So, and we have a lot of cleanup to do. But because of this diversity in animals and plants, we have a lot of material that we produce as byproducts in the form of manure, in the form of bedding material. So we have our own hay that we grow and we cut, and that ends up being used in nesting boxes for 1,200 chickens. And then we have some shavings that we'll get from a local woodworker who will provide it. Occasionally we'll buy bales if we're kind of stuck in the moment, but generally we try not to buy that material. We also use, we have a lot of fun friends with connections for like oyster shells or other shellfish or whatever we can obtain, and ideally for free, to incorporate into our mix. We also work with a lot of landscapers who are local, who bring us wood chips and leaves and sometimes pine needles and grass clippings to add to our compost making process. So in addition, we have our own food scraps that we use on the farm. We also bring in other food scraps from area places. They get fed directly to our animals and sometimes directly to the compost, depending on what it is. And then we have all kinds of, garden waste, weeds sometimes that we're willing to incorporate into the mix. But there's quite a lot of diversity there. So we're fortunate that we're able to produce a lot of material and use it. So for us, it makes sense, to use all the material that we have rather than just letting it sit around. And for us, it's about completing a cycle that exists on the farm as a full circle system. So it starts with the animals on the land and ends with food production, but we all know that a cycle continues to go around, and it doesn't really end. So for me, like the result, if we're doing it as well as we can, is a finished product called compost, right? And I'm a big fan of compost specifically. I've always attributed a good compost to be of a certain color, and I attribute that to a 70% dark chocolate bar. So that's how I talk about it on the farm. So if it looks like 70% dark chocolate, then I'm in, and I'm happy with the results. But composting in general creates incredible opportunities for increased diversity, microbiological life in the soil and in our pastures, which yields healthy animals, grazing pastures, and productive crops. In general as well, that in vegetable production, we don't use any chemicals or pesticides or fertilizers or herbicides or any of those things. But our ability to manage the soil is a way of kind of combating or dealing with or keeping the numbers more in balance when it comes to pests. So there's always insects, the good guys and the bad guys, but keeping those in check is really important on a farm. And I think the composting and the microbiological life in the soil helps to provide that balance so that those inputs completely are not needed. And it doesn't always look perfect, the final product, but it is worth it. And so that's something that we strive for. So in most cases, that work is successful, and we get just what we need usually. So with that said, the realistic situation is that our climate has been changing. There have been conditions that we don't have control over, and there are things as farmers that we're still building. Because we bought an old farm, we kind of inherited all of the problems of the past, and also have been working really hard to kind of mitigate what we can, change, tear down, replace, rebuild, patch fix, whatever we have to do And over the years, our ability to put our money back into the farm has grown, but now competes for the growth of the farm, which requires more labor input. So it's always a balance of, you know, how much labor we can afford and how much infrastructure we need and how quickly can we do it and still survive. And ideally thrive. And so that's a constant ongoing process that brings all of this work into reality. So with that said, we have some challenges related to, you know, managing the fields and managing the pastures so that we can provide the right balance of health across the entire farm ecosystem. One of the issues with climate change, of course, is that instead of getting rainfall periodically over time, and ideally when we're sleeping and not when we're awake so we can actually be productive on the land, we are getting more rainfall over a shorter period of time. And so instead of getting a little bit of rain, we're getting pummeled every time it rains, and it's heavy, heavy rainfall. Very rarely is it a gentle rain storm at this point. And so we have a lot of roof surface areas from our buildings, from our high tunnels, from our, you know, our barn, or even our house, either construction that has existed before we arrived or things we have replaced or built ourselves. And we know that as we continue to build the infrastructure, that's going to be an ongoing challenge. And so we've installed drainage systems in the last few years to accommodate that change, knowing that there's going to be more water runoff from roof surfaces on the farm. And of course, some of that runoff is going right into our crop fields, right to our tunnels. It also doesn't help that on parts of our farm, we have a really beautiful clay pan layer that's just holding water. So that's a challenge that we are dealing with quite often, especially as climate change continues. There's no doubt that that's going on. So we have, you know, again, we bought an old dairy, so it wasn't designed to do what we're doing here. The farm setup was not designed for vegetable production and to have a diversity of animals. And so there has been no proper drainage in place for hundreds of years. There has been erosion in areas that we've been trying to address as quickly as we can. But as we construct and deconstruct, we just find, you know, more issues that we need to address. So we get those super wet conditions in the spring, but we've been getting more extreme wet conditions in the last few years. And that because that extreme rainfall has been coming all at once, we have been, you know, again, having effects with drainage. We're not unable to access our, you know, manure collection areas that are on soil because we don't want to get our equipment stuck. We have gotten it stuck. We've tried thinking, you know, being very optimistic, which sometimes you need to be as a farmer. We think maybe we can get in there if we do this. And sometimes we find that we just can't get in there. And we've actually had a period of 2 years where we would clean out our pigsty area, which of course pigs will mess up and muddy up any area you give them. And they do a great job and they absolutely love it. But if we can't move the material, it's a real problem. And so that has been a problem over the last few years. We are finally just able to get in there. And so that photo that Andrew showed you is a windrow built with a lot of material from that location. And so because of that issue, we have had longer recovery times for areas that need work, and they take a lot longer to dry out enough. So we do have a lot of moisture, but it creates a heavier, you know, or a bulk density essentially that's a little bit higher than it really needs to be because of that material that we're incorporating. In the past, we haven't had that problem because we've actually had like these little windows of time where we could access that material and move it where we needed it. And so now we're finding the last few years have been increasingly difficult in that way. And so because those piles are denser, we are not getting that oxygen moving through as much as we want it to. And even though we're not in an anaerobic state with that current pile that you saw a photo of, we want to keep it aerobic and we don't want it to go the other way. And so for us, it's really important that we increase the oxygen. So sometimes mixing drier ingredients would help with that. But so yes, so again, it's taken a couple of years to access certain areas. We have a big concrete pad in the back where you saw that windrow. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be enough. It's not the right size, but it was there when we arrived. So we've been using it for that purpose and we move material over to it over time. So Yeah, so we have a lot of pig manure in the mix there, but again, we have chickens and we have cows and we have goats and we have sheep. So we have other animals that produce either higher nitrogen results or, a different diverse mix. And so usually for our application of compost, I would say that yes, the word recipe is perfectly fitting, but the recipe that we use determines or is based on the application we are using. So like, depending on what we're doing with it, it might change the recipe. So there's different recipes for different situations. And so that's why like what one farm does isn't necessarily going to work on another farm based on so many factors that we do have control over and that we don't have control over. So I think that's worth mentioning in terms of being realistic. It might work for one, but not for another. So again, with our challenge with that particular windrow, it was taking a longer time for the compost to heat up and to finish. Some of it hadn't finished when Andrew first saw it. And it's harder to move too. And it takes us out of that ideal range to get to the finished material quickly and to be efficient. And quite frankly, also realistically, it's also harder on our equipment. So it's really not ideal for the longevity of our equipment, and it requires a lot more cleanup and work to maintain that in that situation. So some of the solutions around that situation, some of which we had kind of concluded, but we're really excited to work with Andrew of Northern Tilth and also with NRCS. We've been talking about and making plans for this particular thing since 2017. So it does require some dedication and real interest, and my interest has not waned. I'm getting more excited as time goes on about finding solutions. So for us, having a new area for the pigs to be in, that's on a concrete pad that could potentially it will be similar to a bedded pack. It is called a bedded pack, like you've seen in those photos Andrew showed, but we have a different spin and a different take on what that will look like for us. And I think, again, there's flexibility with that funding on how that can actually take place. So having a concrete base rather than just the soil base that we currently have in the pigsty will really be helpful in reducing the need and potentially eliminate the bare soil area that the pigsty is currently causing problems with. So in turn, it'll also reduce the need to wait on accessing the pig areas to clean out and relocate the material, because they'll already be in the space and it will be on concrete and there will be a roof overhead. So I don't think, rain will be a factor in whether we can get in there or whether we're going to get stuck. So we'll be able to do it as needed rather than whenever nature allows us to get in there to do the work. So it'll reduce the wet conditions drastically, but it won't make it too dry based on the material that's there. And it'll reduce the time needed to get to the finishing process once it's moved. And hopefully it'll bring that final product that we're going for back to the ideal range and again, in a timely manner. So we're excited about being able to do that. And the bedded packs that we're lining up right now, one involves cows and pigs, but also gives pigs access to the pile. So it's kind of a hybrid of what we just saw in those photos that were shared. So we're looking to have a roof overhead, but the design is going to have other interesting elements that kind of apply to just our situation. So we're looking at like what that means, and we have some time to lay it out, but currently we're scheduled for the spring to start work. So on working with Andrew and looking at conservation practices and working with NRCS, like essentially the reason that we're doing it is because, the reason I'm doing it is because compost really excites me. Building soil seems like the most useful thing that we can do as farmers. I am confident that it will be our greatest contribution here. In all times, like no matter what season it is, no matter what the weather conditions are, like soil is the most important thing we can do, is the most important thing we can build. And so it's one of the reasons that I jumped at the opportunity to work with Northern Tilth and Andrew, and I'm really grateful for his help in improving the composting process here on the farm. Again, as things change and they continue to, that's the only thing we can seem to count on. It seems like that extra help is going to be really necessary on all levels to get to where we want to be. So a lot of time and planning and data collection, structural improvements such as the drainage systems we've already put in, and also things that haven't been done yet, but we're planning to go for, has gone into making compost happen. So more of all these things are coming, including new structures, like the one I mentioned, including a raw manure storage building, and they're beginning again this spring, and we'll be carrying out over the next few years. So it's going to be very busy here, but I think the results are going to be worthwhile. So as the need for our farm grows, I'm feeling relieved that we are setting it up to accommodate that growth while protecting our natural resources and making a useful finished product that completes the this whole full circle cycle of the farm. So, and then I do additionally believe that working with Andrew and his crew at Northern Tilth plus NRCS simultaneously, I think that's really exciting actually, because I didn't know that opportunity was going to exist when we started this planning back in 2017. So even though it seems like it's been a long time, I guess timing really is everything, because it looks like it's going to come together in a really positive way. Because it's not just about the short-term fix, it's about the long-term process and the long-term focus that will allow us to be able to make really good decisions about what we're doing and where we're heading. And also be very practical so that what we choose to do and how we do it applies to our specific needs on the farm. So I'm really happy to be on the path to creating these solutions. So thank you.
Fantastic. Jess, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule. Farming is constant. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. And same for you, Andrew. It is so hard not to just jump in there with all kinds of thoughts and questions and everything. I am sitting on my hands right now, trying to prevent myself from doing that. I'm going to open up the floor here for questions. There are a few questions in the box already, in the chat box already. Thank you for putting those in there. I'm just going to go through those one at a time here, just real quick. There are a couple of questions in here that may be a little bit difficult. There's not a single answer in here. But we're gonna throw them at you guys and see what you can do here. One moment, please. All right. Andrew, we've got an example in here. And what I'm thinking with this one, Steve, I'll apologize to you. I'm gonna ask you a question, but I'm gonna change it up just a tiny bit. Andrew, in the example in the question box here, there's an example of a pig manure with straw bedding and compost, or straw bedding to compost. He describes the pile 4 to 5 feet high, 20 feet wide, 6 to 8 feet deep, in a triangle shape, coming up to a peak. It can get a peak temperature of 135, but then it starts to drop again. And so my question to you, Andrew, is what are some of the potential problems there? What might he do to try to reinvigorate that?
The fact that it gets up to 135.
Sorry, I can't hear you, Andrew.
The fact, can you hear me now?
Gotcha.
The fact that it gets up to 135 is a great sign and indicates that the mix might be really good. That size seems great. The 4 to 5 feet high, maybe it could go a little bit higher, just especially in colder weather, to get a little bit more insulation. But that's really typical to get a high temperature after you set up the windrow and then to have it drop, and it's an indication of it's ready to be turned, because what happens is the oxygen's getting used up in the areas where the active composting is going on, and then turning it is going to essentially incorporate more air into there and get the process going again. So I'm not sure if that farm is turning on a regular basis, but that is typical that once after setting up the windrow, you could get, if you have a good mix, which it sounds like you do, you're going to get high temperatures for a short period of time, maybe a week or two, hopefully, and then they'll start to drop, and that's at the time that it's good to turn it. So the monitoring is important. It's also, we always kind of recommend monitoring at 2 depths, 1 foot, 3 foot into the pile. So if you see it consistently going down, that's the time when you want to turn it again. There was one above that, about 25 to 1 feed-end ratio. So that is based on, that's looking at the analysis on a dry weight basis. And then you ultimately have to convert that back to your volumetric ratio. But you do have to break it down to the dry weight basis and then work back to the volumetric ratio. So that's on a weight basis, and it's not only a weight basis, but it's a dry weight basis.
Thank you for catching that, David. I'm sorry I missed that one. All right, running down to the next one. This one actually touches on what you just mentioned, but talking about winter composting during the winter time, and what should people look for in terms of trying to create an ideal size for a pile?
Yeah, so it is. You do need a little bit more insulation in the winter, and that's why I say like the 4 to 5 feet might be a little bit low. 20 feet, 5 feet wide seems great. Going a little bit higher might be helpful in terms of providing a little bit more insulation to the inside. Sometimes if you happen to have mature compost covering the pile with a blanket of it, a lot of people do this for odor control at larger commercial operations anyway, but that can give you a little bit of insulation as well, so things inside don't get too cold. It is, I mean, it's sort of surprising, but even in really cold temperatures, if you have the right conditions, cold ambient temperatures, you can get good piles in the good temperatures in the pile. But it is a little bit more work, and you definitely have to make sure the piles have enough mass to sort of be insulated somewhat.
Excellent, thank you. All right, next question, and I'll have to admit I'm very interested in this one. This came up in our conversations just at work not too long ago. If you have mixed species animals, is it better to keep the manure piles separate and compost separate piles, or to mix the piles and get a good mix and then compost?
Definitely mix them.
Definitely mix.
Yeah, get an analysis on all of them, but yeah, I would not make separate piles for them. I would get analysis on them individually, and from that help develop a good mix with them. And if it's just, so this is goats, turkeys, ducks, and pigs. So that could all be, with the exception of the, sort of depends on the bedding. Like with the goat manure might be a higher feed-end ratio, especially if it's heavily bedded, as sometimes I see goat manure being. Turkeys, ducks, and pigs, that's going to be pretty rich in nitrogen, probably low in carbon unless it's really heavily bedded. But I would definitely recommend blending it all together as opposed to making separate piles. There's no reason you couldn't have a great blend with those 4 manures.
Fantastic. Without going into too much detail, I guess, just very lightly, could you touch on why you would want to have the feedstock tested, and where do you like to send your tests?
Yeah, well, for that very reason, getting in a simple spreadsheet, and if someone, we can help people with this, but if you have a feedstock analyzed for carbon, nitrogen, organic matter content, I don't think pH is on that standard one, but just a few things, and moisture content and density, you can come up with a mix that works well, that starts to get into that ideal range. And again, you're never going to be in the ideal range, and you don't want to go to huge expense buying a lot of amendments just to get you into that ideal range. But it can get you a lot closer, and it can help you troubleshoot as well if you are having problems by knowing the characteristics of the individual feedstock.
Perfect. Yeah, my small analogy there is similar to a roadmap. You have to know where you're starting from in order to know where you need to go. And so by getting that information, it helps you know which direction to go.
Right, and you asked the question about where to get it done. So the University of Maine, we use them a lot for manure and compost analysis as well as soil sample analysis. And there are a lot of places to do them. I know them, and we've used them for 20 years. And their compost feedstock analysis is really reasonable. I think it's $55 a sample, or maybe even a little less than that. Their finished compost analysis, which includes more parameters, is up around 65. So it might even be a little less than that. So that's the lab I would recommend. There are a lot out there. Just make sure it's a lab that is accustomed to doing compost feedstock analysis as opposed to a sort of a more strictly environmental testing lab.
Okay, but it could be money well spent.
Absolutely.
Just in terms of knowing what you have and where you need to go with things. Jess, could I throw a question at you just real quick? You mentioned some of the things that are hard, that are a little bit more challenging on the farm, turning the pile, keeping the moisture management worked out just right, the soils, and then some of the changes that you're making. So what are some of the short-term things? You mentioned, I guess where I'm going with this is, you mentioned some of the infrastructure that might take a couple of years to get put in place. What are a couple of the things that you're learning right now that you're going to do, some changes you can make right now?
Yeah, so some of the things that we can do right now is, I'm going to start with chickens because that's fresh on my mind. We're getting ready to organize a plan around relocating them. We currently have a flight pen set up with netting overhead on a concrete pad, mostly concrete. We have a bare soil area that has a curb to catch any runoff, but it is connected to our main barn roof. And our main barn is quite high. It's a gambrel style. And it is, the water runoff is significant, and it goes right off the roof, right into the chicken area. And we've always incorporated wood chips into our system, but I don't think we were incorporating enough of a layer. And the layer is really key in terms of absorbing the water that's now coming off the roof at rapid rates. And we also manage a separate pile there because the chickens like to dig and they like to explore and they like to get their insects and their worms. And so we bring food scraps and garden scraps right to them. And so this way, and a couple times a year, we go in there and scrape off the concrete pad, and we end up mixing the wood chips into that material and then we let it sit before we move it to our back concrete pad, where we're stockpiling other materials like wood chips and leaves and grass clippings and food scraps, so that we can later mix those into a windrow system. So essentially, to shorten it, is we're adding more wood chips. We're doing it more frequently because of the runoff, and that the way the concrete that is there was designed, again, not for what we're doing, but for a dairy farm. There is a slope, which is not a bad thing if you have a way to capture the water. So we have a huge slope without a curb. And so the wood chips will help reduce that flow of water from running off. So that's a big thing. And then just looking at like a total redesign of that, and then trying to get more of our stockpiled materials closer to where we're going to have them for final use. The drainage systems that we put in, the adjustments and piping we made to the driveway to access that concrete pad, the way we're making our windrows, even the directions. So we had them going the long way on the pad, and now we're actually, when we've just recently turned them, we actually made them into smaller piles to manage. And we think that's really helpful too, especially because it was so dense. We were trying to give it some more air and doing a little bit more mixing than we normally would do. That's just for starters.
That's a great start.
Yeah.
That's a great start. That'll keep you busy, no doubt.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, not seeing any more questions coming in, and looking at the time, we're going to try to keep everyone on time this afternoon. So we are going to go for our scheduled break. We're going to take 10 minutes, if you would please. So take a look at your watch and your timepiece, and we'll come back here in 10 minutes and get started with our second half, where we start talking about BioChar. All right. Andrew and Jess, again, thank you very much. All right, hopefully everybody made it back that's able to, and we will get started with our second session this afternoon, where we're focusing on a lot of talk about the biochar. So we've got, I'm going to say that we've got two speakers for you. There's three placeholders. I'm going to speak just very, very quickly about an NRCS practice that is related to some of this biochar, or more specifically, the soil carbon amendments related to soils. But the featured speakers today are going to be two different sets of people. If I may introduce both of them at this one time here. The first one is going to be Dave Newman. Dave is an environmental lawyer and conservationist with over a dozen years of experience promoting sustainable fisheries through law, policy, and science. Over the past several years, Dave has shifted his work towards sustainable food and agricultural ventures, including local value-added food businesses and collaborations with two diversified biodynamic farms. David is passionate about ensuring local farmers have access to long-term land tenure and the development of economically feasible models of climate-friendly farming and ecological land stewardship. Dave chairs the county's Climate Smart Task Force and serves as a member of the county's Environmental Management Council. So Dave is going to be presenting about the use of biochar and compost for propagating and planting trees. And the second set of presenters will be from the University of Connecticut. We'll introduce Huijie Gan, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Connecticut Department of Plant Science and Landscape Architecture. Her research investigates fundamental questions about soil biodiversity, nutrient cycling, and plant and insect interaction, as well as practical challenges in how to improve soil management for sustainable agriculture. And presenting today also with Huijie is Monique Machoud. Monique is an undergraduate student also at the University of Connecticut, studying sustainable plant and soil systems. Her academic interests include soil health and sustainable agriculture. And they are going to be presenting their information, work, and research related to biochar and the effects of biochar when you add them to New England soils. All right, so to get this started, I will introduce this NRCS practice. I should probably introduce myself. I apologize. My name is Jim Hyde. I'm with USDA NRCS, working as an agronomist out of the Tolland office in Connecticut. I work primarily with animal production agriculture, but also get to work with grazing systems, cover crops, soil erosion, and soil health projects. I did grow up in the Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas areas, but I've spent the last 26 years here on the East Coast, focusing work on soil nutrient management and working on a variety of projects to bring education and different opportunities related to soil health to area farms and providers. All right, just a moment and I'll switch over my screen here. See if I can get this done. And Jess, I'm gonna throw up, if you're still here, I'm gonna throw another picture at you. On this first slide here is actually a picture of one of Jess's high tunnels with an actively growing cover crop in there. I thought it was a beautiful picture just by itself. But when you start looking at the other things going on there, it kind of represents everything that Jess was just talking about in terms of feeding the soil, the biodiversity, the biodynamics, the nutrient cycling, everything that she was just talking about is kind of represented right here, which is quite by accident, but I'm glad it happened. So thank you, Jess. All right, back to focus here. I'm gonna just mention very quickly this NRCS practice standard related to soil carbon amendments, also referred to as the 808 standard. The soil carbon amendment standard is an interim conservation practice standard right now, which means that it's available for the next 3 years, where a handful of states have optioned in to try this practice out. During these 3 years, NRCS is going to be collecting information from the different farms as the practice is put in place. And this practice is intended for the application of organic carbon sources, typically as compost or biochar, in order to help improve soil health and functions. Some of the soil health resource concerns that would kind of initiate the soil carbon amendment being used on a farm are things related to organic matter depletion, soil compaction, aggregate stability, or the absence of aggregate stability, the need to improve aggregation. And the last one is soil organism habitat loss or degradation. And in parentheses, just an emphasis on improving the soil biology within the soil. So this is looking for ways to add carbon for the benefit of soil health. The definition here of the soil carbon amendment is using amendments from plant or animal residues to improve the physical, chemical, and biological properties of the soil. So it's looking at all 3 of those different functions within the soil. The purposes are to improve the soil, to improve the organic matter, the quality and the quantity, to improve the soil aggregate stability. The idea behind that is that a soil with more aggregate stability will have a lot more functionality on a number of different levels. The aeration, the porosity, the ability of the roots to travel through the soil, the ability of water to move up or down through the soil profile as we receive rain or as plants need moisture from the subsoil, are all things that would affect aggregate stability. Other improvements include soil biology with the help of the improved habitat. So this is being championed as soil carbon amendments, providing habitat. A little bit of the concept, if you build it, they will come. So if you provide habitat for the soil microbes and provide them with the food and habitat, that you'll get that nice diversity that we're looking for. There's also improvements to plant productivity and health, largely to what we had just mentioned, the soil biology, the soil tilth, and the plants being able to have a more hospitable soil for growth. The last one is to improve the moisture management within the soil profile. Again, kind of aggregating, excuse me, didn't mean to say that, combining all of those different functions that we just talked about to help improve the soil management within the soil profile. The intended land use for this practice is all land uses where soil carbon will help improve soil conditions. It is intended for active and farmed lands. The exception that it would not be available for use on would be native grasslands or fallow land as well. The process in order to use this practice on a farm would be to sign up with USDA NRCS under their EQIP program or other programs that are offering this, this conservation practice standard. And then after the application process, if the application is contracted, then reimbursement would follow after a successful completion of the soil carbon amendment. So after the carbon amendment has been a plan put together for the amendment and for the land area that is going on, it's the amendment is put in place onto the soils. And after that's successfully done, with the planning and the implementation, then that project would be completed and it would be available for reimbursement. Emphasis on the reimbursement part, meaning that the money is paid up front to make the practice happen, but then the reimbursement follows successful completion. This practice is intended to help with some of the costs that are commonly associated with the successful adoption of this practice. And the intent here is that this practice could be adopted on the farm for future years. So these monies are intended to help ease into adopting this practice on your farm if you find that it works for you and it's doing good things, that this could just continue without the incentive practices. But some of the costs of the reimbursement that would go towards this would be soil tests, purchasing the biochar or the other carbon materials, shipping, including trucking, the land application itself, getting it onto the fields, and then incorporating the material into the soil as well. Some of the most common costs associated with those. Some examples of different processes for this standard, adding soil carbon, is 100% biochar is an option. They have set a minimum amount that they would like to see used. There is not a maximum amount, although in some of the information we'll see later today, I would encourage you not to go too crazy with the amount, but the minimum amount is 1 ton or 4 cubic yards per acre to get to the improved soil health goals in there. The second option is the compost plus biochar mix. And this is something that will be referred to later on as a charged material. So charging the biochar, incorporating it with something else to get some of those biological or chemical reactions start underway. This is at a 10% either weight or volume biochar mix. Again, a minimum application rate of greater than 3 tons per acre or 6 cubic yards per acre of this mix. There's also the scenario for 100% compost, either a low or a moderate application rate. This is available for both larger scale field applications, but also it's available under some of the urban initiatives going on across the country as well. So on a square foot basis. One that I still find interesting is the whole orchard recycling, a real effort to try to keep that carbon within the area that it was generated. And so whole orchard recycling is an option available for farms now as well. There's a lot of material. Well, there's a decent amount of material in the standard, but to help understand it best, it would be ideal to read through it yourself. Fairly easy to find, I believe. The process to find that, go to your favorite web search, look for the Field Office Technical Guide, or you could just do a web search for NRCS FOTG, FOTG. That'll take you to the USDA NRCS website. For the Field Office Tech Guide, you'll be able to select your state. Once you've selected your state, then you can find the section 4 for practice standards. And under the practice standards, you'll be able to scroll down and find the soil carbon amendment number 808, and it's available to read. Just very quickly, I do have a copy of that. I can flash that up here very quickly if you find that useful. This is what that looked like. So standard code 808, soil carbon amendment. Again, it's got the definition, the purpose, the criteria. So these are the different criteria that the farm or the producer would be asked to meet for all those things. So it's got a number of different things spelled out in here. So what would be worth a look, and then as you have questions, please feel free to contact anyone at the USDA NRCS, and we can work to get you answers to your questions. All right, so with that, I will stop there and we'll get to the good stuff. I will stop sharing, and Dave, just a heads up that you are up next.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jim. Can folks see the presentation now?
Right now, I can see you.
Yeah, there we go. How about now?
That looks good. Yep, it's online.
Okay, great. Well, it's good to be here with everyone today, and I will try to be brief so that there's time for questions. I am a recovering environmental lawyer, now a farmer, and I'm in Columbia County in the Hudson Valley, so just adjacent to a lot of where you folks are. And we launched Arthur's Point Farm over the last couple of years. We've been working on it. It's a bare root tree. We mainly specialize in trees, nursery, nuts, fruits, and other important ecological species. We also grow a lot of perennial wildflowers, and we've been making biochar since we started the farm. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. We are involved in various ecological restoration projects on our farm and with other landowners and farmers in the area as well. So what I want to talk about is kind of what is biochar and how we make it on the farm, how we use it. And then I want to share a bit about what we're just launching a novel approaches research project through SARE Northeast. In fact, our inaugural workshop is tomorrow with 10 farmers that we're working with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that research and why we think that's important. First, I'll say thank you for organizing this to the organizers. We appreciate the opportunity to share this information and get together with folks. So just to jump in, we started making biochar out of curiosity from reading the literature, from understanding what its potential benefits are. We were very curious how it might apply to perennial crops, which has been less studied than its application to annual crops. We use a retort kiln that we imported from the UK. It's a pretty durable unit. It's not intended to do everything that we'd want to do with biochar, including retaining and reusing the excess heat and energy produced in the process, but we're learning a lot and we're producing really high quality biochar. So let's get into it. The first thing to think about with biochar is what it's made out of, and it can be, it's the feedstock can be any biomass, including municipal waste. And the interesting thing is municipal solid waste and waste to energy plants are some of the largest suppliers of commodity biochar. So if you go out there and you look for a tote, a cubic yard, or a truckload of biochar, and you're looking to buy it at a reasonable price, chances are it's coming from a large gasification plant that is primarily designed to produce energy. And it's not all municipal waste. A lot of it is from biomass, other biomass, woody biomass, or crops that are grown specifically for that purpose. But its primary purpose is to produce energy, and it's a kind of a byproduct that it produces some biochar. And the important thing here, as I'll get into in the next slide, is that the process matters. But here we're talking about the feedstock, which also matters. So if you're using woody biomass that's clean, you're not likely to get any kind of contaminants or metals or any other pollutants in the char. But if you're getting biochar from a source that's unknown, I would definitely recommend strongly getting lab tests so you know what you're actually putting in your soil. The other factor, in addition to contaminants or pollutants in the char that you want to avoid, is the pH. And gasification produces at a much higher temperature than pyrolysis, produces char that typically has a much higher pH and can have a liming effect on the land, whereas the char that we're producing through a lower temperature pyrolysis is producing biochar with a pretty balanced pH, just above 7. So let's get back to feedstock. So what we use in our area and what we recommend and what we think is the most sustainable, construction debris. We don't actually use construction debris. We would like to see segregated waste streams where we can get clean construction debris. There's a lot of it. It goes into landfills, and it's a great source. We do use mill scraps from our local wood mill, sawmill, and that's a benefit to being in an area with resources like that. And I think around all of our areas, there are resources that are available, whether it's a sawmill or whether it's the local town with wood chips or other things that can be used. Biocarbon crops, from a whole life cycle analysis, can be really, are very intriguing and can be, in theory at least, can be really can lead us to a carbon negative solution where we're actively growing fast growing crops like willow or poplar, and we're sucking the terrestrial carbon out of the atmosphere that we're then actively turning into biochar and incorporating back into the land. And then forestry debris is another source that we see in our area as being something that's we take from our land and from surrounding lands. The carbon footprint of all of this is not a one size fits all, obviously. So having local feedstock is really important. And we've all heard stories, I think, or many of us may have, about biomass energy mandates in certain parts of the world, particularly the EU, where it's led to the import of biomass from other parts of the world. And we certainly don't want to create that kind of commodity market, which drives the opposite of what we're after, which is sustainability and producing something that is actually carbon negative, or at least carbon neutral, as we're also trying to serve the soil and the other purposes. The production process, as I mentioned, you can be it's basically heat in the absence of oxygen, where you're cooking the biomass, you're not burning it, and we all have seen different aspects of this if you've got a very efficient stove at home where you get gases that are coming off of the wood. Those gases get recirculated, retorted, and burned again. And that's essentially what's happening, but without the consumption of the biomass, it's turning it into biochar, it's converting it. In addition to biochar, there are two other products that you could say come out of the process: heat and energy, and capturing that excess energy and heat for drying biomass or for heating a greenhouse or a warehouse makes a whole lot of sense, and will drive the process to be even more carbon neutral or even carbon negative. The key thing to take away from this is the feedstock and the process, the type of process, whether it's pyrolysis or gasification, the temperature, the time, the residence time of the conversion, all affect the type of biochar, and that all biochar is not equal. So be aware of that. We've seen biochar with pH over 10 or 11. So that is much different than something that's balanced. So moving ahead, this is just an image a video of the bottom of our retort when it's of the kiln while it's making biochar. And we start the process with wood to get a fire going underneath the chamber that you can see the bottom of, which has it's contained with the feedstock in it. And after it gets up to about 300 or 400 degrees Celsius, it starts to retort, and that energy coming out of the wood is what's driving the process until there's no more energy coming out, and then it's finished. And the whole process, in our case, with our equipment, takes about 8 hours per batch. But this just gives you a sense of what that looks like while it's going, and that shouldn't be too much of a surprise for people that have been around fires and retorts and stoves and all that. Let me see if I can get forward. Okay, so now the most interesting part, I think, why most of us are here is, what do we do with it? Why is it useful? And there are four basic areas of utility or ecosystem services or uses on the farm. First is as a soil amendment for sequestering carbon, as a way of managing manure and controlling pollution of effluents. And that was discussed earlier in the first session, of how do we deal with the leachate that's coming off of some of these compost facilities or some manure lagoons. And biochar is has potential to help that process. And then it's also used as for digestive health, and this is a very old practice. So just getting into those a bit, the reason why biochar is useful in the soil is because it provides habitat for microorganisms. It has porous structure, it has a huge amount of surface area, and it is both adsorptive and absorptive, meaning that it will attract things to its surface, and it will also help dissolve things into the substance itself. So it is really good at holding water and serving as habitat for microorganisms. That, of course, is what helps our plants grow and helps us grow too. It's particularly useful in depleted and sandy soils with low organic matter. And the one meta-analysis in the peer-reviewed literature that we refer to, which looked only at annual crops, reported a gain of 18 to 28% on productivity with fields that were using biochar. And of course, that is one set of studies that needs to be, we need more research essentially, both given the variability of biochars and how we might use it on our farms, and also in particular with tree crops and perennials, because there's been very little research in that area, which is what we're working on. The second area is as a climate, as a form of natural carbon sequestration. We might be familiar, some of us, with large carbon capture and storage facilities that have been talked about for a long time, where we can have our cake and eat it too. We can continue to live kind of burning fossil fuels and then sucking them out of the atmosphere through some technologically advanced process, which requires a huge amount of fossil fuels and energy and resources to build. Well, trees are the original form of that, and any kind of biomass really, but trees are particularly good at carbon capture, and they do some of the storage through their roots and into the soil, and biochar can actively and quickly help convert some of that biomass that would otherwise be burned or decay and go back into the terrestrial carbon cycle. And we can take it and we can actively sequester it for thousands of years. And studies have shown that there have been carbon dated soils where they found that in the first meter of soil, that some of that carbon is as old as 5,000 years old. So if we need to buy some time to convert or transition our economy to something that's carbon neutral, eventually carbon negative, this is something that will help us do that if we can manage to scale it up and really ensure that we receive all of these other benefits that make it worthwhile. The other thing, as I mentioned, it can be used to manage waste and waste streams. Nitrous oxide and methane are two of the most potent greenhouse gases, and much more potent than carbon dioxide. And 80% of our nitrous oxide in the US comes from agriculture, and 40% of methane comes from agriculture, mainly from tillage, soil management or mismanagement, fertilization, and livestock and manure management. We really need research. There's evidence in the literature, and there are some projects that I've read about, none around here, but we really should be doing research into how we could use biochar to control some of those emissions, and at the same time charge, as Jim mentioned, the biochar and the manures, and turn those into an even more attractive source of fertilization for our fields. There are carbon credits that are beginning to be sold in the voluntary markets, and the question that I have is whether and how we can scale those so that they would benefit small to medium farms. There's more on that to be continued. But as I was saying, manure management and pollution control is an area that I think has come up and always comes up in these conversations, and there's an opportunity there to do some more research. So if anyone wants to follow up on this, we'd be keen to partner with folks on that type of research. And then the last area of benefit is livestock health. And you can go back thousands of years to literature that talks about the practice of feeding animals activated carbon or char. In that case, they were talking about char. Currently, the modern feed amendment would be some sort of activated carbon. And essentially, it helps with nutrient uptake. It helps to absorb toxins in food, and it improves overall health. And there's more literature that supports this, peer-reviewed literature that reports weight gain, feed efficiency, egg production improvements, immunity improvements, hygiene, odor control, and lower vet costs from studies on using biochar and controlling for that input and seeing what the effects are. And the European Biochar Foundation has, because it is more popular in Europe as a feed amendment, has a certification standard for how to use it for animal feed. So there's a lot of information out there as to how we could incorporate it and expand it. And that too would be another fertile area of research in our area with livestock farms that we'd be keen to help support in any way we can. On Arthur's point, we make 2 biochar products. We are now selling this one. It's a combination of biochar and a microbial soil inoculant, which includes 20 species of beneficial bacteria and 7 species of soil mycorrhiza, along with food essentially for the microbes as they're establishing in the soil. And the way we use this is either for planting trees, for garden beds, or for enhancing compost. And I'm not going to go into the formulas, but in the literature, there's information on how we would apply it and how we recommend using it and what we're using. This is just a quick video to show you how we make biochar compost, the combination, the second product we make, which is mixing our raw biochar, which you can see there, with the compost at the early stage of the composting. And I think that's very important. And it's very important as a general matter. From what we've read and what we've observed, we don't recommend using biochar straight into the soil unless you have some time on your hands to let it inoculate naturally in the soil with the microbes and the nutrients that are already present. Because the initial response will be to leach some of those from the surrounding soil rather than adding value. So what you want to do is charge the biochar either by adding it to a manure slurry, adding it to compost at the early stage of its composting, or adding an inoculant like the product I just showed you. So I'll just play this real quick. It's less than a minute. All right, here we are on Winter Hill Road, Arthur's Point Farm, making our biochar compost. So this is co-composting the char. So we add it in early. You can see it right here. It's in there. And we add it in to the manure, the wood chips, the cabbage, and the biodynamic preps that go into our windrows. And so the char is inoculating while the compost is cooking. And here we have a fresh batch of chipped biochar we just brought over, and a very fresh batch of cabbage from Farm Ferments. Thank you, Farm Ferments in Hudson, for all of your scrap. So this stuff is chipped very fine, very granular, and it's just straight charcoal that we make in our kiln on the farm, and we mix it with wood chips, with cabbage, with manures, and with straw. All right, here we are. All right, well, I'm just gonna, I'd like to pause, but I won't because I'll just power through. There's just a few more slides. I just wanna highlight the research that we're doing thanks to a SARE grant that we're just launching this month, looking at how does biochar on its own and in various combinations with compost and the amendment that I mentioned, how does it affect the health and productivity of the soil and in particular chestnut trees. The goals of the project are to assess the efficacy of biochar in agroforestry as opposed to the annual crops where it's been used more frequently and reported on more, to generate farmer knowledge and hands-on information or practical information for farmers, and to provide resources and networking, and to figure out how we can overcome the barriers to broader adoption. We'll be testing, we'll be doing 3 rows of 80 trees, alternating chestnut, black locust, and the black locusts are there for poles and for nitrogen fixing in the soil, and to provide some shelter to the baby chestnut trees that are growing, And then eventually they'll be cut down within the first 10 years or so for poles. So we'll be testing in 4 replicates, native soil as our basic control, just raw biochar, compost, and it will be top dressed annually with just compost, no biochar, biochar and compost, top dressed with the biochar compost amendment, and biochar compost and the microbial amendment mixed together, top dressed with biochar compost. This is a 3-year project. Of course, trees will take a lot longer to provide evidence of the benefits or the lack thereof. So we hope to continue this far into the future. This is just the experimental design for the field. And we'll be looking at 4 different kind of areas of indicators or assessment metrics: tree health and vigor, soil health and microbial abundance, nutrient bioavailability through leaf samples, and deep carbon sampling to see what happens over a longer period of time. And this probably won't be evident within 3 years, but over a longer period of time with regard to long-term carbon in the soil. We're looking at 1 meter deep, and we'll be looking at the top 15 centimeters and then below for 2 soil horizons. And we're expecting, or our hypotheses are that the biochar compost plus the microbial amendment together will have the greatest benefit for across these assessment metrics. That planting only in native soil, which is probably the default for most farmers who are planting chestnut trees and many orchard trees, is not going to do as well as just compost or the biochar treatments. And that straight biochar without compost or amendment will have negative effects, at least in the first few years, or at least not any beneficial effects. Those are our hypotheses, and that is my presentation. So I'm happy to take questions. And I kept it to 20 minutes.
That was extremely impressive, Dave. Thank you very much. Right on the nose. We do have a couple questions in the chat box. If other people do have questions, I think, is there a way to raise hand or something like that? If you could just let us know that you've got a question, that would be great. I'm going to run over to the chat box just very quickly here. There is 2 questions specifically that came in. A question just kind of very generally about biochar is the energy that it takes to generate biochar. Would you be comfortable talking anything about the energy used to produce biochar? And
sure. The biochar we're making through retort reaction is all self-produced, except for the initial feedstock. So for the first 2 hours or so of an 8-hour process, we're feeding waste wood into the bottom of our kiln. And that's how we start the process. That's how we heat it up. Once the feedstock in the inner chamber gets hot enough, around 300 degrees Celsius, it starts to off gas. And the gases first have a lot of moisture. You want to try to dry that out as much as possible for a more efficient process. But once that moisture works itself out, you retort and you direct that all of those gases back into the inner chamber, and it's self-sustaining. So a pyrolysis process, a batch reactor like that, and I think even a continuous pyrolysis at a lower temperature, 450 degrees, is designed to do that. And so there is some initial energy that's needed, but you're then producing, once it gets going, we're producing a prodigious amount of extra gas that we have to flare off the top of our kiln, because our kiln is pretty rudimentary. We don't have a way of capturing that gas safely, and we don't have a way of capturing the energy, all the heat. So that's where the real benefits come into play. As you can get to a point where you're able to capture that gas, you can use it to dry feedstock or for other purposes, like a greenhouse. So as we get to the next scale of what we're doing on our farm, and this was really how we wanted to start, we're looking now at a technology that will be more of a continuous reaction that will allow us to capture that energy so that we are even more efficient. But there's no, I mean, there should be very little, if any, external energy needed for the process. Now there are other, there's something called the carbonator, which is basically a machine that eats or that burns through and reduces woody biomass, and forestry companies use it. And it essentially produces about 5% of the biomass is converted about 5% or 20 to 1. We're getting about a quarter from feedstock to biochar. It's about a 25% conversion ratio. And that carbon is approaching 90% in the carbon content of the final product. The carbonator, on the other hand, is using an external fuel source to basically burn through as much of that biomass as possible. To me, it's a real shame, but I understand why it's used in certain applications.
Sounds like they have slightly different goals there.
Yeah.
All right. And related to this, Huijie has dropped in a reference for people to click on as well. It's about some of the energy emissions related to that as well. You can find that in the chat box. There's two other quick questions. I'm going to lump them together just a little bit, but there's a question in here about food waste, and is food waste too wet? So if I could expand on that to Kat's question as well about just the foodstock products, being careful. What are some major things that you should watch out for? Kat has a question in here about using pressure treated wood. So between moisture and chemicals, what things do you need to watch out for?
Yeah, I would say you definitely would never want to use pressure treated wood in or products from anything like that in your compost or your biochar. And that is a challenge with construction debris. I mean, the big challenge there is segregating clean wood, but a lot of the wood that's used in building construction is not treated at all. And that's where I think you get a benefit. You need some policy, I believe, to make sure that there's a requirement to segregate that. There's a cost involved as well, 2 dumpsters on site, for example, that type of thing. But there's definitely an opportunity there to work with the construction industry to figure out a way to make that work. With food waste, I wouldn't bother trying to make it into biochar. You could dry it and turn it into biochar. You can use bone, you can use a lot of different substances. So from a slaughterhouse, a bone could produce or will produce a very calcium rich biochar that could be very interesting. And if anyone has a source of a lot of bones, we'd be interested in trying that out. But we haven't linked up to a slaughterhouse yet. But the moisture content of food waste would be a challenge. And I think you'd be better suited just to compost it, which is probably just a better use of that food waste.
Fantastic. That sounds great. All right, Dave, if we may, I will set it down there and we will switch over to our next presenters. We've got 2 of them. We have Huijie Gan, again, a postdoc researcher from the University of Connecticut, and Monique Choud, also from UConn, presenting today, talking about their biochar research, looking at adding biochar to New England soils. So Huijie, may I pass it over to you, please?
Jim, we
Yep.
hear the audio, okay?
Coming through, yep. Just encourage you to project a little bit, and if you'd like to switch over to presentation mode, I think you'll be in great shape. Terrific. Looks great.
Thank you everyone for staying with us today. Today, me and Monique are going to talk about some biochar research we're doing here at UConn. And here's a brief outline. We're going to cover some basic of biochar, emphasize on the critical properties and how those properties are affecting biochar in the soil. And then Monique's going to talk about the first experiment that we did here, focusing on the potential use of biochar to reduce nutrient leaching from inorganic fertilizer. And the second experiment that we focus on applying biochar in combined with compost and liquid manure. So what is biochar? It's a simple definitions provided by US Biochar Initiative. And this definition also speaks the importance of using biochar as a soil conditioner. And our previous speaker, David, already gave a very good overview about the production process of biochar. So here is a recap. When you put the feedstock into the pyrolysis reactor, there's going to produce some of those like gas, and what's remaining is the biochar. So it really depends, the end product is really depends on what you put into the reactor and the conditions of the reactions. So for example, if you use mostly plant-based feedstock and you're likely to contain cellulose, which is basically a complex carbohydrate with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygens. And under high temperature, some of those hydrogens and oxygens are going to leave as gases or some kind of volatile organics. And what you have behind is a carbon-rich stable products that is very difficult for microbes to break them down. And when those gases leave the raw materials, they're also creating a lot of micropores that increase the porosity and the surface area of the biochar. And those high porosity and surface area are really good at hold on to water and some nutrients. This is a graph summarizing studies that looking at the biochar persistent in soil as a functions of pyrolysis temperature. So the y-axis is the estimated percentage of biochar carbon remain in soil after 100 years. And you can see that there's a lot of variability in terms of the pyrolysis temperature. And in general, in lower pyrolysis temperature, the persistence is low. That means that after 100 years, you're likely to, having very little amounts of biochar carbon left on the ground. And based on this review, you can see that in general, if you have a pyrolysis temperature above 840 Fahrenheit, then you are likely to have 80% of the carbon that remain on the ground after 100 years. And what happened of the temperature effect is that at higher temperature, you got driving up more of the hydrogen off as gases, and then you end up with lower hydrogen and carbon ratio. So in general, if you have like a hydrogen to carbon ratio less than 0.5, then you're going to have a pretty good persistent biochar carbon. And to better understand what happened when you add biochar in the soil, we need to take a look at the microstructure of the biochar. And this is a schematic representations of the microstructure. And you can see like the gray area is kind of the backbone of the biochar. And those white area represent the pores structure. What's scattered outside or inside the surface of the biochar is all this like reactive sites. Those could be some polarized carbon ring or some oxygen functional group that we're able to bind to other nutrients such as like cation and ammonia. And when you add those structures to the soil, they can even interact with organic compounds that are already in the soil. And the porosity also provide a lot of habitat space for microbes to live on. And it's both those chemical interactions as well as the biological effects of biochar that determine how the biochar influence the overall soil functions and soil health. And if soil carbon sequestration is the primary interest of biochar applications, then we'll need to look at how biochar interact with existing soil organic matter or the other like organic materials that you add into the soil. And in soil research, they have been found that they could potentially suppress, which in this case, we call them like the negative priming effect. That means that when you add biochar into soil, it can actually slow down the microbial decay of other soil organic matter. And in addition to this negative priming mechanisms, you also have indirect mechanism by improving the soil fertility so they can have higher crop productions, which will increase the return of crop residue, particularly those from the root carbon input. So this is kind of like the theory or conceptual what could happen. But when we look at the research out there, looking at how biochar affecting existing soil organic matter, there's a lot of variability. This graph is showing the summarize of research from 21 study overall. And you can see that even though there's a slight negative priming effect, there's a lot of variability, depends on the feedstock. In this case, crop residues seem to have a negative priming, which is good for the soil carbon. And then wood seems like not much differences, but slightly positive. And in addition, soil textures also seem to be important in determining which directions the biochar can affect soil organic matter. And as David already mentioned, that you can also use biochar during the composting process to improve the synergy effect of biochar and composting. And some of the benefits people find is that during composting, you can actually reduce the nutrients loss, particularly the loss through nitrifications and other process during the composting process. And you end up having end products that has a higher nutrients and that could potentially benefit plant growth as compared to the normal composting process. But again, when we look at like empirical study out there, there's a lot of variability. But overall, the number of study is not that many. And you can see that depends on the compost material. You have a wide range of effects. And the application rates also seem to play a role. So for us, given this variability, we're particularly interested in how we can use biochar in agricultural soil here in Connecticut to maximize its potential benefits. And in the remaining of the talk, we're going to focus on one of the main thing, which is like a nutrient retention. And this study was mostly conducted by Monique as part of her independent study. So I'm going to hand this over to her.
Hi, everyone. So the main objectives of this study was to evaluate the effects of biochar amendments on nutrient leaching and to also compare the differences among the biochar feedstock types and particle sizes that we chose to investigate. So the study design was a total of 10 treatments of varying biochar types and sizes, some with inorganic amendments, at a total of 44 pots, 4 replicas per treatment. So the following information was provided by the supplier that we obtained the biochar from. We chose to focus on wood biochars because they're the most commercially obtainable, and we focused on softwood and hardwood. As you can see, there's many similarities between them, both having a pyrolysis temperature of around 500 degrees Celsius, similar hydrogen-carbon ratios and pH values. The main difference that we see is in the softwood having a slightly lower carbon content and almost double the ash content of the hardwood. Now, both of them do have an extremely high surface area, as mentioned by everybody, of almost 350 square meters per 1 gram of dry weight biochar. So for reference, just to give you a bigger picture of how contrasting those numbers really are, pictured below is 1 gram weighed out of biochar, which is relative in size to a penny. And in just that small amount of biochar alone, the surface area is equal to a basketball court. So it really does emphasize how much surface area is just packed into such a small amount of biochar, which, as everyone has mentioned, gives biochar many of its properties. So although the two biochars, hardwood and softwood, were very similar in surface area, they did differ slightly in pore space and size. Further analysis was done by the UConn lab to look at the pore space, and it showed that hardwood biochar did have more surface area coming from micropores and mesopores, which is under 500 nanometers in size, pictured here, represented by orange and blue. So for comparison, 500 nanometers is only about the size of a single bacterial cell. So what this means is that the hardwood and softwood biochar have a significant portion of their surface area coming from pores smaller in size than microbes themselves. So for the materials and methods, the soil that we used was obtained from a sweet potato field at Fort Hill Vegetable Farm in New Milford, Connecticut. The vegetable field soil had relatively low organic matter levels, and this was to help replicate soils typical of Connecticut vegetable farms or other cropland areas that would benefit from biochar application. Because wood biochar is the most commercially available, we chose to focus on the two biochar types mentioned before, softwood and hardwood, that differ slightly in properties and slightly in price as well. The two biochar particle sizes used was coarse, which was defined as 2 to 6.35 millimeters, and fine, which was defined as 1 to 2 millimeters. And those were sieved to meet within the defined ranges. And as you can see pictured on the right, there are some visual differences that you can observe. Hardwood on the top, softwood on the bottom, coarse on left, fine on right. And what we did tend to see is that within the defined ranges of both coarse and fine, hardwood tended to have a greater number of larger particle sizes within each range. Inorganic fertilizer used was applied at a rate of 150 pounds per acre, analysis 2020, and it was applied at the time of establishment of the pots as a top dress liquid solution. So the biochar was applied at a rate of 10% volume per volume, which is equivalent to about 30 tons per hectare wet weight. 10% volume per volume is a high application rate, not only labeled on the biochar bag itself, but in literature, the common application rates range anywhere from 5 to about 40 tons per hectare. So 30 tons per hectare certainly is on the higher end. And biochar was mixed with the soil and lightly packed into pots that were small soil columns, about 2 inches to 7 inches in size. So the pots were set up and fertilized in early November of last year. And throughout the following months, 1.5 inches of rainfall was simulated over the course of several leaching events. For today's presentation, the data will focus on leaching events from day 1, day 10, and day 60 from time of setup and fertilization. On day 32, 4 winter rye seeds were seeded in each pot to help us give a better understanding of biochar's effect on plant growth and nutrient retention. And those were later thinned down to 2 seeds per pot to give a more accurate representation of a realistic planting rate for cover crops like winter rye. And then on day 68, the pots were destructively harvested and soil samples along with root and shoot tissue samples were harvested for future analysis. So the nutrients tested from the leachate included ammonium, phosphate, and nitrate concentrations, and nutrient analysis was done using the Gallery discrete analyzer pictured here. And the Gallery is a scientific instrument that we use to analyze water samples for different nutrient concentrations using the EPA water testing standard methods described below for each nutrient. So pictured here is ammonium concentrations in leachate from the corresponding rain events on day 1, day 10, and day 60 respectively. Orange represents the treatments receiving fertilizer, with green being the unfertilized treatments, and CT meaning it was soil control, no biochar added, SC being softwood coarse biochar treatment, SF softwood fine, HC hardwood coarse, and HF hardwood fine. As you can see, the leaching was definitely greatest immediately after fertilization on day 1, and biochar effectively reduced ammonium leachate concentrations by over 50% in fertilized treatments. During the plant growth period, we also observed that ammonium leachate concentrations were minimized, although among individual biochar types and sizes, little differences were observed. But based on these observations, biochar did reduce leachate concentrations significantly of ammonium. And similarly, phosphate concentrations, biochar did effectively reduce phosphate leaching from fertilized and unfertilized treatments. Particularly in day 60, we saw the highest amount of concentrations in leachate. And the hardwood treatments, the treatments receiving hardwood biochar, had a significant reduction as compared to the softwood and control treatments. And then finally, overall, nitrate concentrations didn't see as much difference as the phosphate and ammonium, especially as compared to the different treatments and the control. But the one significant notable difference that we did see was in day 10, the second leaching event, there was a slight reduction in biochar for the hardwood treatments, which aligns with our phosphate conclusions as well. And then this brings us to our next point, where I'll hand it off to her about how it affects plant growth.
Thank you, Monique. So we'll continue to look at how the biochar applications will further affect the plant growth. And we have two hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that if leaching is reduced from the soil after biochar applications, then there should be more nutrients available for plant growth. And the competing hypothesis is that if biochar holds on to those nutrients tightly, then even you have less leachate, but you still have less of plants available nutrients. But when we look at the actual plants, we actually see that in the fertilizer treatments, soil receiving the hardwood fine biochar, which is kind of like on the far right side of those pots, it seems to have the best plant growth. So we destructively harvest the plants and quantify the total roots and shoots biomass. And the total plant biomass, as you can see, is indeed the highest when receiving the fertilizer in combination with the hardwood fine biochar. And another thing that we're interested in is to look at the relationship between the plant biomass and the nutrients lost. So with the soil only treatment without fertilizer, we don't really see any correlations. But with the one that receiving NPK fertilizer, we saw negative correlations between the plant biomass and the nutrients loss. So in combined with the leaching data that Monique presented, so this kind of like support our first hypothesis that biochar indeed be able to reduce nutrients loss, and those nutrients are further available for plants. And for our second experiment, we are going to focus on organic amendments, including compost and liquid manure. And we're going to look at the similar biochar effect on water and nutrient retentions, plant growth, and hopefully in the long run, we're also going to be able to quantify the change in soil organic carbon. And we're going to expand the factors that we are going to examine, including different biochar types, the application rate, and mixing with other organic amendments. And here's the summary of the factors that we look at. And the two soil that we use, the same one is the low organic matter soil Monique used for her study. And we also, in comparison, include a high organic matter soil that has been receiving dairy manure for a long run and resulting pretty high organic matter content in those topsoil. And the same to biochar. At the same time, we're going to look at different biochar application rate. And for those biochar, we're either just using the raw biochar or mixing them with leaf compost, livestock compost, or liquid manure. And I want to mention that those composts are already finished compost. A little more details about the material that we use. And I want to point out that the compost application rates we use is a medium rate. So that means that they will give us a mixing ratio between the biochar, either like 1:3, 1:1, or 2:1 ratio between the biochar and the compost. And the liquid manure, we use typical application rates around here, which is 8,000 gallons per acre. And we mix them up, or we mix up the biochar and the compost and the liquid manure one day at a time as a specific ratio. And then the next day, we further mix them up with the soil and pack them likely into the same kind of soil columns. And for today, we are going to present some of the results we got from day one collections. We are still, this research is still ongoing. We actually still have those pots in the greenhouse. So we're going to show you some of the preliminary results that we got. And we're going to focus on the hardwood biochar on the first day after we set up the pots. And this is like the leachate volumes out of 1 inch of water added from the top. And again, you can see that, oh, another thing that I want to point out is that, so the dashed line, which will represent the baseline from the soil only treatment, because we have 2 biochar rates. The yellow bar representing no biochar, like a 0 biochar, and the darker bar representing a high rate of hardwood biochar added. And the x-axis represents whether those biochar are mixing with other organic materials or not. So on the far left, the yellow bar represents the soil only treatment, and the dashed line representing the baseline for the soil only part. So you can see that the volume of leachate was reduced with hardwood biochar in the low organic matter soil, but we actually see very surprising and mixed results in the high organic matter soil. And we're still trying to understand what's the reason. And when we look at the nutrients compositions of those leachates, here's what we found. Consistent with the inorganic fertilizer study, we saw that the hardwood biochar reduced ammonium from all the organic mixes in both soil. As you can see by comparing the yellow and the dark color bar here. And for the phosphate, we also see the same effect when the biochar is mixed with the leaf compost and the liquid manure. You can see that it's both occur in the low organic matter and the high organic matter soil. Again, what's surprising is like when we look at the livestock manure, it seems to be like the opposite in the high organic matter soil. For the nitrate, again, we found the same thing, that the hardwood biochar at a high rates reduce nitrate leaching from the leaf compost and the liquid manure. But this is only happening in the low organic matter soil this time. And for the high organic matter soil, it seems like they are pretty consistently increased. So we're still trying to figure out why that's the case. And possible mechanism could be the increased microbial mineralizations of the high organic matter in that soil. So a quick summary of what we have found so far. Basically, in the low organic matter soil, we found that the applications of commercial wood biochar at a higher rate can reduce ammonium, phosphate, and nitrate from organic and inorganic fertilizer, which is in turn can benefit plant growth. But things get even more complex when we're dealing with soil with very high organic matter. The effects of biochar and leaching seem to be variable depending on the specific nutrients and the organic mixes. For the ammonium, it seems to be pretty consistent along all the organic mixes. But for the phosphate and nitrates, it seems like it depends on the organic materials. Again, we think that there have to be involved some kind of microbial mechanisms. Also, the research, we're still actively further trying to capture more of the results from the study, and we particularly will be interested in pursuing further research on how biochar will affect the microbial activity, as well looking at the further impact on plant growth and change in soil organic matter carbon sequestration over the long run. So we do have a few take-home message. So the first thing is that biochar properties, which is vary a lot across different feedstock and pyrolysis temperature, the properties will affect how they interact with soil and eventually determine their functions in soil. And a charged biochar, either you charge it with like an organic or organic fertilizer, they can have a positive effect on reducing nutrients leaching in the low organic matter soil, and which could potentially benefit plant growth. But still more work to be done to understand the biochar effects on high organic matter soil. because we think that that would be involve more of the microbial mechanisms. And we also want to point out that the study we conduct is in the lab, and we have this very specific procedures of leaching them. So, might not be applied to like field conditions, and that's what we are hoping to do in the future, to set up like a field plot to examine more of those, to see whether some of the things that we observe in the lab will be applied to field conditions. I think that's what we have, and thank you everyone. We're happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Weijie. And thank you, Monique. That was a fantastic job presenting. Some really great information there. I'll have to admit, I was extremely interested in these results, because when we go out to farms, when I have an opportunity to go out to farms, one of the questions that we get asked is, what about biochar? Should we use biochar? And something that I really value is local research. And that's something that's in these age and times, it's getting harder and harder to find this local research. So I'm extremely happy that you're doing this. Thank you for doing this. If somebody asks you that question, if somebody that's growing has a farm and they ask you the question, should I consider using biochar? How would you answer them? Do you have an answer for such a broad question?
Yeah, I would say that like depends on what you're trying to achieve. Also depends on how you think of the bigger pictures on whether biochar as a whole, including all the production process, transportation process, whether it's going to like contribute to like zero carbon, or whether it's actually like even more like a carbon emissions. So like definitely like locally produced, if you have access to local local products that rely on sustainable like feedstock, you know that they have a high quality biochar, it should be okay to use. And even though like in our result, it seems like some of those like high organic matter soil seem to have more like a nitrates and phosphate leaching after you add biochar, but there seems to be like a effect of biochar increasing microbial activity. So it really depends on how you're going to combine with other management practice. For example, if you already have plants on the ground, which is in like Dave's case, like if you have an orchard, and the biochar effect on microbial activity is actually a good thing, because in this case you have like more nutrient available for the plant. But if you don't have plants on the ground already, the increase in microbial mineralizations are just going to contribute to more leaching. So it's really kind of like depends on, I guess my answer to the question is kind of like, it depends, like, what your goal is, and also whether you will be able to combine the biochar in addition to other management practice that help to like improve the overall like a soil health. Yeah.
I think that's a great answer. And my thought process on that is just that it's really important. I think that it's important to walk into the biochar world with eyes open, and just some of your take-home messages I thought really hit home. Just be aware that there are differences between the biochars, the way they're produced, what the feedstocks are. Dave, your mention of the pH around 11 or so was a bit jarring. So just really important to be aware that there are differences between biochars. If you were to go walk up to a shelf and pull it off the shelf, there's going to be differences. The other key one that's sticking with me is just, excuse me, this topic of charging the biochar. Weijie, you mentioned you had a little bit shorter charge time with yours. Dave, you had mentioned you had, it sounded like maybe a longer charge time with yours. Do either of you have any feeling about what is a good charge time, or what is a good method for trying to get that charged biochar in a mix?
I think, there's a scientific answer, which I would like to hear. I can't provide it. And then there's a kind of an anecdotal, practical answer. And I think allowing the biochar to kind of inoculate in a compost from the beginning is a surefire way, in my opinion, to make sure that you're not adding something that will leach. It will absorb. And so in our case, we're starting a compost in the spring with the manures. We're adding to it throughout the year. And then, we're using it the following year. That's a long time. I don't think there's any concern there. The other thing is adding an amendment of dry microbes or compost teas that are high in microbial activity, where you know that you're infusing the biochar. I think the residence time isn't necessarily as important as what you're mixing it with and how. But so I think I'd be curious what the scientific answer is.
I don't really have any like a direct research related to this part, because for us, we just kind of like mix them a day ahead before we add it into it. And there will be like a different study that if we have the opportunity, we can like further pursuing, how long like the different mixing process will affect the performance in the soil. But like theoretically is also kind of like depends on the property of the raw biochar that you have. Some people like concerned about like if you're adding like raw biochar, especially the one that have a lot of like ashes content, then all the nutrients might be just leach out from the biochar itself. But if you know that you have a biochar that is pretty high quality, which means that just like carbon-rich materials, does not really have any labile nutrients that are be able to easily decompose or leach out, then it wouldn't be like a big problem. And based on our studies, in just one day, that it can still significantly reduce the especially the liquid manure, the ammonium in the liquid manure. So that means that like the ammonium, for example, can quickly bind to like the biochar from the liquid manure. So that seems to be pretty good. And the other thing is just kind of like, if you have biochar that high carbon, you might also have to concern about nutrient immobilizations, because sometimes they would be like lock up the nutrients. But at least in our case, we didn't see that happening. So I guess I don't really have an answer for how long you should like charge them for before application.
I guess the important takeaway is just knowing that it does need to be charged. And so, using Dave's approach of being sure as heck that you've got it in there from the start of the process, or something in between there. Sounds like it should cover all the bases. All right. Well, again, with respect to time, I'm gonna call it there. And Huijie and Monique, I want to say thank you very much. Dave, thank you also for taking the time out of your day not just to present, but to put this information together and share it with all of us so that we can learn from you and what you're doing out there. So thank you very much for doing that. There's a couple other people that need some thank yous as well. This is very risky to do, mentioning people by name, because there are so many people involved in this effort. But some people that are actively behind the scenes today helping to put this together right now. I want to send out a thank you very, very sincerely to Chelsea Han and Cheryl Baldwin from Connecticut DEEP, extremely instrumental in putting this together. Amanda Fargo Johnson as our ringleader and organizer to pull all of this information together and help with this. Thank you all very much for doing this. Of the other people that must be mentioned, there is just an impressive list. If I can share the screen real quick. There is just an impressive list of people involved in this effort. Oh goodness, that's another screen. So I would encourage you to just be aware of all these people, and that all of these people are working to help bring this information to you and get this education and information out there. Again, all voluntary efforts that's in there. And there is also a Connecticut Compost webinar history. There's a link down here that you can go and you can look at last year's webinars. There was some really terrific ones about everything. The very beginning of compost, how to create compost, compost recipes, compost infrastructure, waste management, lots of terrific stuff from last year's presentation. All of this year's presentations are going to be online as well. If I can get to it, I also wanted to mention, again, with thanks to Cheryl Baldwin, that there is a Google Groups with the Connecticut Compost Network. And that's something that you can check out. You can put your name on the email listserv. And admittedly, Cheryl is probably the best one at sharing information related to composting and composting efforts. But there's, for the people, Cheryl, I'm going to misspeak here. You can hit me later, but largely towards more the municipalities and organizers of composting properties, that would be pretty relevant information. That Connecticut Compost Network. Sorry, get that spit out here eventually. All right, and with that, I will leave you to your afternoon and your evening and say thank you very much for attending, and thank you again to our speakers for presenting.